The title of the presentation, Fragmenting Reality. This is something that we know about already. We know that Russia seeks to smash apart the truth. But what we don't recognize so often is that an explicit goal of Russian disinformation is equally to form new communities, communities that are not necessarily based in the truth. The first point that I will make is that Russia lies, and Russia lies constantly. I don't think that is a surprise to any of us in the room, true? Almost anything that comes out of the Russian media seems to be unbelievable. The media's job in Russia is not to report on reality, it is to create reality. And that's why it does things like the business with the Freedom Convoy, to turn it into something more important than it seemed to be. But I want to ask, really, what does it hope to achieve with this? Is it simply to destabilize our shared understanding of the truth, so that everybody in this room might have a different interpretation of reality, a different interpretation of events, so that we can't come together and agree on what is true or not, thus undermining democracy, undermining political discourse in Canada, and enabling Russia to go about and achieve its various foreign policy goals of invading Ukraine, messing around in Eastern Europe, messing around here, and so on and so forth. But I also want to think in particular about, why does anyone outside of Russia believe this stuff? When it so transparently comes from Russia today, to take the Freedom Convoy as a good example, we can tell you it comes from Russia today. This is fictitious. It's not real. This story isn't based in reality. There's no truth to it. And I don't know about you, but there's been moments when I've just been tearing my hair out, what little hair I have left, over the last year and a half, and asking, why won't you listen? And I can tell you, the guy that lives downstairs from me in Kingston, average Kingston suburban white guy, grew up in Canada, fully Canadian, he believes all of the lies. Anti-vax, Freedom Convoy, the war in Ukraine was started between China and Russia. This is genuinely words that have come out of his mouth as a plot against the West and a plot to undermine Canada. Just mad stuff. He's a gym instructor. He's always lived in Kingston, small town Canada. Why do you care? Why do you believe it when it's not true? Before I continue, I do just want to say I'm about to go into some examples that are about Bucha. And if anyone is not comfortable listening and doesn't want to talk about it, then please, now is the time to make your exit for the next 3 or 4 minutes as I get into this, because it's a little bit dark. And I want to show you how rapidly, as I get into this, how rapidly Russia forms and reforms the truth. Now, a colleague of mine, Jade McGlynn, and I wrote an article for Foreign Policy just after Bucha happened about the way that it was covered in the Russian media. And we looked at the different realities that came out of one Telegram channel in particular. The channel is Ukraina.ru. It is a new channel formed by the Russian state. It is not labeled as a state channel, but it is clearly state-sponsored. Professionally made, looks like real journalism, even if it's not, has all the trappings of it. It has, as of today, about 350,000 subscribers on its Telegram channel, and the bigger, more successful posts that it posts will reach 3, 4, 5 million subscribers on Telegram. So this has a very big reach. Now, first news of Bucha broke in the West. It was not broken by Russian media. And by the West, I'm including Ukraine as well, so not Russia. And they responded pretty quickly. At 1:21, Ukraina.ru published a post that basically said Ukrainian forces went into Bucha after it was recaptured, and they targeted collaborators in particular, or people they saw as collaborators, and they killed them. Those are the bodies that you saw lying around. Ukrainians did it, and the Ukrainian army did it. 9 minutes later, they came up with a different story. Ukrainians shelled Bucha, and that resulted in the bodies that you saw in Bucha. It's a completely different explanation. Two realities. 40 minutes later, none of it's real. This is just a plot to blame Russia for killings that it never committed. There are no deaths, it's all a fake. They took a break for a while. And then they started again with this, it was all staged, it's a provocation, it's not real. They did it before to us in Syria. They often come back to this narrative that white helmets in Syria supposedly are sort of evil terrorists. A couple of hours later, we have conclusively proven that there was no violence under the occupation, so they've managed to conduct a pretty rapid investigation there in, a couple of hours in the morning. Good job. And then a couple of hours later, they're trying to break us. It's a plot by the Western media. So what we see here is a number of different stories. Now, these stories weren't actually individually produced by Ukraina.ru. One of them was a reshare from the Russian war correspondent Sasha Kots, who you may have heard of. Was one of the more well-known Russian war correspondents and has, if not the biggest, then one of the biggest Telegram channels in Russia. The 1105 story, we've proven there was no violence, was a reshare from the Russian Ministry of Defense, which finally made a statement. But what we see here is that even on one Telegram channel, multiple realities can exist. And very quickly, what seems like a small story, a few Ukrainian forces targeted a few collaborators, is blown up into what is a genuine conspiracy theory. And a conspiracy theory usually involves stories like this. It's a plot against us. A small group of people somewhere are controlling the media, are controlling world events to target us. And I'll talk about what us means. And we have what appears to the viewer or the reader, what looks like different sources being drawn in and from different angles proving that all of this is true. But all of this can't be true, you would agree. All of these things can't be true together because some of them are mutually contradictory. So what we see here is not an effort to prove that something is true. The effort is to create a shared sense of reality, a sense of us and them, the inside and the outside, the Russian and the non-Russian, the good and the bad. This is the way that Russia flattens out the nuances of reality. And so if you were going to make a quick model of it, it would look like this. You see material coming from the mass media, coming from astroturfed groups. Astroturfed means they look like groups that are online, that are ordinary people, but actually they're fake. They're produced by the government, by state operators, funded by state operators, or they take the material directly for them. But you also see entirely spontaneous organic groups sharing material like this. And if you look deep into the ether on Russian Telegram, you will find groups of spontaneous actors who create basically copy and paste hate and harassment fake stories, often written in different languages. Here is the Arabic version, here is the English version. Go to this Facebook group and post this under posts. So a good example was when Alla Pugacheva was criticizing the war and criticizing the Russian state, they came up with copy and paste, go attack Pugacheva whenever she's mentioned on Twitter in English, right? Paste this down there. So there are real people behind this as well. This doesn't just come from the state. And what you have is that these groups confusingly feed into one another. The mass media posts something, it ends up on an astroturf group. Organic groups post material, like Sasha Kots, and then it feeds back into the mass media. And then you have this sort of circular sharing, as they're constantly resharing each other's fake realities and re-perpetuating that sense of shared community and shared values. And as they do this, what they're not doing is creating the truth and seeking out the truth. They're creating a different reality, an allegorical reality, in which it is our world, in which we are all discussing, we are all talking to each other, everybody on the outside is against us because it's a plot. They are against us and somehow they are controlling things. Now, sometimes when we hear about Russian propaganda, we hear about this term, the fire hose of falsehood. Has anyone, most of us in the room have heard this term? Yes? No? Lots of no. Then I'll explain very briefly. So this is the idea that Russian propaganda simply functions like a massive fire hose of lies. I spray it all over the room. You don't know what's happening. You're blasted in the face by all these different stories. You just sort of, hosed down, you give in. And you don't know what to believe anymore. But I think that doesn't really explain what's really happening here. It doesn't really explain the creation of shared values and shared communities. Because sharing these conspiracies, sharing this disinformation, creates a world in which I feel valued if I belong to that community. I feel safe. You're giving me a way to understand events that I don't understand. And in particular online, if Marcus and I belong to a group that is packed with lies, packed with fake stories, I don't trust any of you because you're on the outside, but I'm going to trust Marcus, regardless, right? As I should trust Marcus in reality. But regardless of what Marcus says, if he shares something, it could be the most egregious lie, I believe it. This, by the way, is called horizontal propaganda. If you want to read one book about the way propaganda works, there is a French scholar writing in the 1960s, Jacques Ellul, and he differentiates between vertical propaganda, propaganda that comes directly from the state or some authority down to you, and horizontal propaganda, the propaganda that I share from friend to friend, peer group to peer group, and so on and so forth. And guess what? Horizontal propaganda is far more effective than this top-down vertical propaganda. So the more that Russia can create these shared communities, that yes, are individually fragmented, but in and of themselves have a shared reality or a shared sense of inclusion and exclusion, the stronger the disinfo. Because ultimately, when it comes to conspiracy theories, and this isn't just about Russian disinformation, any cult, any conspiracy theory is all about creating a sense of in-group approval, a sense of stability in the world. So what Russia does by sharing this information is, yes, it blasts you with the fire hose. It batters you. It fragments everything. You don't know what to believe. And what do? You come running to the people you trust, the people you value, regardless of real reality. And in general, we see that Russia is taking a transnational approach to this and increasingly trying to build up communities around the world that focus around a core set of values, national pride, the sort of extreme nationalism, religion, and in particular the idea of so-called traditional religion, what Russia would call, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church, which nowadays is a pretty distorted form of what Christianity actually is. I don't think they're very good at love thy neighbor right now. So-called family values, by which it means relentlessly attacking LGBTQ people, queer minorities, and saying these people are in the outgroup, these people are part of the plot to get you. There is a suspicion of outsiders built into this, as with any conspiracy theory. But what is also important to recognize is that these conspiracies, that Russia spreads at least, also lead, and I just attended an excellent presentation by a colleague of mine at Queen's, who's done research on this, and people who believe these conspiracy theories, either on the far right or the far left, which Bogdan mentioned, are more prone to encouraging and accepting violence against authorities and against representatives of the state wherever they live. And we saw that with the Freedom Convoy. So what do we do about it? Well, on an individual level, we have to recognize that you can't fight individual stories. Fact-checking is almost pointless. Fact-checking will do nothing to pull people out of these groups. Because if Marcus is in the group, and I tell him, well, actually, you know what, here's what really happened in Bucha. He looks at me and he says, you're an outsider. Therefore, by definition, anything you say is a lie. And he will say, you're challenging my sense of reality. You're challenging my sense of stability and security that I've built up, in particular online around these communities. And therefore, whatever you say is a lie, I'm going to reject it out of hand. Instead, what we have to do, and this is hard, is offer replacement communities. Values, stories, and communities that tick the same boxes. You want to feel valued, you want to feel secure, I'll give you something that does the same. But you don't need to fact check the story to do that. So the first step is to bring people into a different community. Once they're outside of the unwanted community, the dangerous community, that is the time that you can start bringing them back towards reality. And I'm not going to go too much into depth on how to do this, but if anyone's interested, you can ask me and I can talk at length about it. All of this then is related to Russia's foreign policy goals. And if you read the national security doctrine that they released last year, the broad foreign policy goal is to end the so-called unipolar world, in which they say America is in control of everything, and to create a multipolar world. By fragmenting and recreating much smaller communities, in particular smaller communities that are more likely to have values shared with Russia's own values right now, Russia only strengthens its politics and strengthens its foreign policy goals. So in conclusion, the fire hose of falsehood will not stop. They're going to keep doing this. They're going to spread lies around, but don't get distracted by the lies. Don't get distracted by the individual stories. As hard as it is, you've got to keep working to reach out to people. If you have family and friends who are getting wrapped up in these wild conspiracy theories, it is the hardest thing in the world to say to them, I still love you. Why don't we go hang out and just talk about normal things and not talk about politics for a while? We can talk about politics down the line once you've moved away from this. Otherwise, you won't be able to stop it, because I promise everybody is constantly exposed to these communities. You all see this disinformation regularly, constantly. And even though you're all pretty aware of what's going on in the world and what Russia is doing, I guarantee you will sometimes see propaganda and not know it's propaganda. And the same is true of Marcus, the same is true of me. Nobody's special. That, I think, is about where I'll stop, except to pitch my book shamelessly. It got some good reviews about how chilling and sad and miserable it is. If you scan the QR code, it will take you to the details. And the best endorsement of all, it got a really horrible review in RIA Novosti. So, like I said, Russia always lies.
Ian, thank you so much for today's presentation. Can you provide a little bit more context as to what Russia is doing in Russia and abroad in information warfare?
So Russia has essentially created an environment, in particular domestically, in which war is an ongoing process. War never ends, whether it is today's war against Ukraine, whether it is yesterday's war against Georgia, against Chechnya. You could also argue even internal wars against homosexuals, against ethnic minorities, or anyone who doesn't fit into a narrow box of what it means to be Russian. But we're also thinking about tomorrow's war. The logic of the state is that Russia needs war. It needs sacrifice. It needs a victim to blame for its own failures, for its own failure to live up to the promises that in particular Putin has been making since the year 2000. And therefore, when the war in Ukraine ends, and it may end tomorrow, it may end in a year, it may drag on for a long, long time, we just don't know, another war has to happen unless there is some major change in the government. And increasingly, we're seeing that young people are being brought up into this environment in which they interpret the world through these very narrow black and white and frankly rather dangerous terms.
You've recently published a book in Canada that was released in July, Generation Z. Can you please tell us where one could purchase it?
So it's available online, Amazon, all bookstores will be able to carry it, and it's a relatively good bargain and hopefully an interesting read.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Folks, it's great to be here today. I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so sort of looking at some of the things that Ian was talking about, but more in the specific sort of Canadian context and how Russia is using information and influence operations here in Canada. And we know, of course, this is not a new phenomenon. We're going to look at how Russian state narratives flow out of the Kremlin and into our living rooms in Canada, and the tactics used by the Kremlin to specifically achieve that, including the army of influencers and enablers it deploys to amplify their disinformation in Canada. And finally, I want to look at the narratives connected to what we've all been seeing and hearing in the wake of President Zelensky's visit, and the fact that these same narratives, when manipulated and weaponized by the Kremlin, have been identified by the UN as inciting genocide in Ukraine and hate right here in Canada. So first, a little bit of historical background. Some of you probably already know a little bit about this, but I still find it important to highlight the fact that Russia has been in the disinformation game for a very long time here in Canada. In fact, over 80 years. And we know this because in 1945, a GRU cipher clerk stationed at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa named Igor Guzenko walked out of the embassy with a trove of sensitive Soviet government documents, many of which identified Canadians who had become Soviet intelligence assets. In his position as a cipher clerk at the embassy, Guzenko was privy to top secret communications between the Soviet embassy and Moscow. During this time, he became aware of Soviet influence operations in Canada that included assets who were members of parliament, government officials, academia, and journalists, the details of which were included in the documents he passed along to the government of Canada. Now, the intelligence Guzenko provided to the federal government resulted in 21 arrests and 11 convictions. Most importantly, it brought Allied attention to the threat of Soviet espionage and influence operations inside the Western world. Now, thanks to Guzenko, we know that Moscow took an early and very keen interest in targeting Canada with influence operations. Guzenko himself explained why and what the Russians were interested in this 1966 CBC interview, and I don't believe the Kremlin's objectives have really changed much in Canada today. So if we can all try to listen at the very small speakers, I hope you can hear what Igor Guzenko has to say here.
But there can't be that many people in Canada who can provide useful information to the Saudi government. What's the point of these companies?
Well, it's influence. I would say useful information always useful. Technical analysis is useful. But most important is influence.
These are being
Influence politically.
to soften up attitudes towards the
Well, there will be everything which is useful from time to solid government.
So the Kremlin's objectives today, as it was 80 years ago, is to influence our governments, to a certain degree, to influence our government's decision-making and to manipulate and distort our understanding of both domestic and foreign issues, and to erode cohesion within our society and the trust we have in our government, media, institutions, and eventually each other. Now, on their own, as Ian earlier explained, these Russian narratives developed inside the Kremlin are unlikely to have any sort of significant reach or impact outside of Russia. So they rely on various platforms and influencers who help them amplify their narratives here inside Canada. And the first step is narrative development. This might happen inside the presidential administration, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the SVR, or even the GRU. Those narratives are then passed along to Russian state media, who are ordered to transmit them domestically and abroad, and to Russian diplomats and embassies around the world. These diplomats, if we can call them that, aggressively promote these narratives both publicly and privately. We also know that they pitch them directly to journalists and media outlets, like Bowden, in his introductory remarks, noted that Justin Ling, this Montreal-based journalist, wrote earlier this year specifically about how Russian propagandists inside the Russian embassy tried to pitch a story about Chrystia Freeland's grandfather. He rejected this story, but the Ottawa Citizen, as Bowden mentioned, took the bait and has kept this story going and has lit a fire under it for quite some time. These narratives are then pushed out to and published by a constellation of proxy sites that are closely aligned with the Kremlin. This website on the right, Global Research, was identified by the United States State Department as being a significant pillar within the global Russian disinformation ecosystem, and it's published right inside in Montreal. From here, extremists on both the far left and far right share these links in their own propaganda and on social media. Platforms will then republish those articles, laundering any connections these narratives have to the Russian government, and they create a veneer of independence. This is one of the most important components within the Russian disinformation laundromat. The Canadian influencers, enablers, and collaborators who, through their amplification of these narratives, threaten to falsely legitimize them. In the most outrageous cases, these Russian-aligned influencers appear on Russian state media and even travel to Russia, where they meet Russian foreign ministry officials. Many of them regularly advocate for Ukraine to cede territory that is being stolen by Russia and against Western support for Ukraine. Although these influencers operate primarily on the fringes of Canadian media, their social media posts receive significant engagement by conspiracy theorists and Canadians on the far right and the far left of the political spectrum. And unfortunately, over the past week, some of these influencers and proxies have been interviewed in Canadian national media about the situation in Parliament the other week. By doing so, these pro-Kremlin activists have been unwittingly legitimized in national media and now represent an ongoing and significant threat to our information space. An example here of the social media reach of articles written by Kremlin-aligned Canadian influencers. This RT article was published 1 week before the start of Russia's invasion by University of Ottawa professor Paul Robinson. This article is being viewed by nearly 6.5 million Facebook users. 6.5 million viewers on Facebook. Now, it should be noted that in most European nations, RT and Sputnik's website and social media channels have been blocked. You simply can't access them, online or otherwise, but that's not the case in Canada. You can freely go to RT and Sputnik and see the sort of disinformation that's being published there. Now, the ultimate goal of Russian propagandists is for their narratives to penetrate into established mainstream media and to achieve legitimacy for the domestic influencers whose geopolitical views align with the Kremlin's. This University of Ottawa professor, who has promoted conspiracy theories about Maidan, has appeared regularly on RT, which is, of course, interested in his theories. But over the past week, he's appeared on some new platforms, including CTV National News and many others, where he's commented on President Zelensky's visit to Parliament. His comments in the Globe and Mail and appearances on CTV News ensure that we'll be seeing much more of this U of Ottawa professor in the future. Now, as you can see, Russian influence operations have remained a core part of their weaponization of foreign policy ever since the end of the Cold War. Even as the Cold War was winding down, Canada remained an important space for corrupt Russian officials and oligarchs. British author Catherine Belton has alleged that a Russian emigre living in Canada, Boris Burstein, was a former KGB officer recruited to transfer state and Communist Party wealth out of Russia on the eve of the collapse of the Soviet Union. His Canadian company Cibico is alleged to have been part of this scheme. During the 1990s, he managed to become very close with some Canadian elected officials. On the right is disgraced former Russian Senator Vitaly Malkin, who was tasked by Vladimir Putin to lead the Kremlin campaign to lobby against Magnitsky sanctions legislation in 2012. Malkin has tens of millions of dollars invested in Toronto real estate and tried to become a Canadian citizen for nearly 20 years. He was rejected over and over again due to his alleged involvement in international organized crime. He met with Canadian parliamentarians in 2013, though, to try and influence them to stop supporting Canadian Magnitsky sanctions. Other oligarchs close to Vladimir Putin, like Oleg Deripaska and Roman Abramovich, have in the past invested billions in Canada. Abramovich is said to have played a kingmaker role for Putin in the late 1990s, and his Avraz Steel employs thousands of people in Saskatchewan and Alberta. With that comes, of course, significant political influence. And the Kremlin has continued to seek out domestic Canadian influence in the post-Cold War era by identifying and exploiting morally corrupt former officials, academics, and journalists by co-opting them to advance Russian interests and narratives in Canada. They do so by offering former Canadian diplomats positions on the boards of Russian companies and directorships on Kremlin-sponsored trade promotion organizations. Academics are given high-profile advisory roles on state-controlled think tanks like Vladimir Putin's Valdai Club and the Russian International Affairs Council. These former officials and academics use their professional titles to gain access to elected officials and lend their credibility to pro-Kremlin views when they speak in Canadian media without disclosing their associations with the Putin regime. In the past, they've lobbied against Magnitsky sanctions, as I said earlier, against NATO expansion, and they also discredit critics of the Putin regime and have advanced the conspiracy theories about Ukrainian Canadians controlling Canada's foreign policy. Now here's a short animation that we created for DisinfoWatch that looks at how a former Canadian diplomat might become an asset of the Russian government.
Here's one way that a former official might collaborate in such a network. Let's make up a name, Artemis Anybody. Artemis Anybody used to be Canada's ambassador to Mordor, a country run by kleptocrats who engage in mass human rights abuses. After leaving his post in Mordor, Ambassador Anybody was offered a position on the board of a Mordor Trade Promotion Association and an advisory role on Mordor's state-run think tank. The former ambassador would appear as a Mordor expert in media without disclosing his connections with the regime. When he appears on national news, he plays down Mordor's human rights abuses, repression, and corruption, assuring Canadians that we can work together on issues of common concern like climate change in the Arctic if we just stop criticizing Mordor's mass human rights abuses. Canada, he argues, isn't perfect either. He accuses anyone who criticizes Mordor and its kleptocratic leaders of Mordorphobia in order to discredit them. Whether they're former diplomats, politicians, academics, or journalists, when people like Ambassador Anybody use their title to legitimize the disinformation and propaganda of foreign authoritarian regimes and collaborate in their influence operations, they threaten to manipulate public opinion and undermine the integrity of our democracy.
Now, perhaps the most insidious component of the Kremlin's cognitive warfare against us is psychological warfare, and the marginalization and intimidation of critics and entire communities. The Ukrainian community is more aware of the impacts of this campaign today than ever before. As an Estonian Canadian, I can empathize. Our community, along with the Latvian and Lithuanian communities, have been targeted with the same Kremlin neo-Nazi tropes since the Cold War. In the past, I've personally been targeted with this narrative by Kremlin-aligned proxies and influencers here in Canada for my activism and criticism of the Kremlin and for identifying some of these proxies. I can tell you that these attacks are psychologically exhausting in my case. This also led to a series of threats against me and my family, and ultimately death threats that were investigated by York Region Police. Now, the origins of Russia's modern post-Cold War use of this trope dates back to around 2007, when Russia organized riots in Estonia known as the Bronze Soldier Riots. I thought it might be interesting to play this clip here of the Kremlin's proxy in Finland, Johan Backman. He was really the first modern sort of foot soldier in Russia's information warfare targeting the West. When you watch this, you may chuckle because what Backman says here is absurdly extreme. But at the time, Backman was able to impact Finnish foreign policy towards Estonia and Russia with these narratives. And he was actually taken quite seriously. And this was in Finland, which is, of course, Estonia's neighbor. So imagine how these sorts of narratives impact Canadians who have very little awareness, if any, of Estonian, Ukrainian, or Central and Eastern European history. So let's see what Professor Backman has to say. That's really quiet, isn't it? So in this video, basically Backman is saying that the Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were never occupied by the Soviet Union, and it's simply a myth that this ever happened. And this was ongoing for a number of years, this narrative, and actually gained traction in Finland at the time. Now, I want to bring up one more example of how rampantly Russia uses the neo-Nazi narrative. In 2010, United Russia, this is Vladimir Putin's political party, organized a radical nationalist indoctrination camp for the Nazi youth movement. Johann Bachmann was a celebrity guest at the camp and took these photos of the critics of the Putin regime with effigies of their heads on spikes, each adorned with a Nazi cap. On the left is former US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. According to Putin's United Russia, she's a Nazi. Next to her is legendary Russian human rights activist Lyudmila Alexeyeva. She too is apparently a Nazi. Among the other effigies were Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, Russian rock star Yuri Shevchuk, Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili, and former Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves, all critical of Putin, and coincidentally, all apparently Nazis. We know, of course, how this same narrative has been weaponized in Canada over the past years, repeatedly targeting Canadian critics of the Putin regime. Here we can see just a few of the hundreds of examples of how our Deputy Prime Minister has been targeted. Among the most sinister is this more recent example of, on the left, which is a crudely manipulated picture of the Goebbels family with Adolf Hitler. This is being published by a Canadian far-right extremist who falsely identifies Magda Goebbels as Ms. Freeland's grandmother. It's been retweeted nearly 3,000 times. We laugh, 3,000 times this has been retweeted. And it's being exposed to millions of users on Twitter. The outcome of these attacks is, of course, intended to discredit those who are targeted by them. It's intended to intimidate us into silence. It's a form of Russian transnational repression, and it provokes hate against our communities among those who are unaware of our history and experiences. And we also have evidence of this. In November, I was part of a research project that conducted a NANOS poll, which included questions that were intended to measure Canadian awareness of Central and Eastern European history. Our poll found that just 8% of Canadians felt fully confident about their knowledge of this history, including Ukraine's history. This low level of historical awareness simply allows the Kremlin to manipulate and exploit our histories. These narratives and tropes have contributed, unfortunately, to a rise in hate, intimidation, and incidents of violence against the Ukrainian community. The dehumanizing effect of relentlessly accusing Ukrainians of being neo-Nazis who are controlling Canada's foreign policy while sucking up weapons and finances is leading to threats and violent confrontations. And this was already happening before the war. Reports of anti-Ukrainian violence have grown steadily since then. Car tires have been slashed, Ukrainian businesses have been vandalized, windows smashed, and threats of violence have been directed at Ukrainian student groups. And this has impacted other communities as well. Last year, this letter up here was sent to the Estonian Honorary Consul General in Toronto, threatening to spread anthrax if Estonia continued to support Ukraine. Putin's weaponization of information is now manifesting itself in physical threats through radicalization. Finally, last week, the head of the UN team investigating Russian crimes in Ukraine, Eric Mose, said that, quote, the rhetoric transmitted in Russian state media may constitute incitement to genocide. He said that, also said that his team was continuing its investigation of this issue. Unfortunately, this sort of hate speech continues to pour into Canada, despite sanctions we've placed on Russian state media, streaming services that are much like Amazon Fire Stick or Roku, but only carry Russian state television services, profit from, and continue to inject aggressively hateful Russian narratives into the Canadian information space. One of these companies offering these services is actually located right here in Toronto. Now, as I mentioned earlier, RT and Sputnik remain available online in Canada, and Russia's Canadian cheerleaders are able to operate without fear of any consequences. If the UN recognizes that these Russian narratives are an incitement to genocide, why then is the Canadian government allowing them to broadcast and to be amplified in our country? Now, I think it's impossible for me not to mention the very difficult situation, again, that emerged in Parliament the other week. The pain and the embarrassment that this caused has been felt in multiple communities. While the debates about it in Parliament and in Canadian media have been necessary, some of the rhetoric that has emerged, including the decontextualization and oversimplification of the incident, are, of course, extremely problematic. And they threaten to further entrench some of the Russian disinformation narratives we've talked about today. Now, from these images, we can see how the Russian government is grotesquely exploiting this situation as part of its efforts to incite hate towards Ukrainian Canadians and genocide in Ukraine. But it's not just Ukrainian Canadians who are affected by all this. All of us are. Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Finns, Poles, were all affected by these crude generalizations that we've been hearing on Canadian airwaves this past week. That anyone who fought against the Soviets is a Nazi and therefore an enemy of Canada. Now, the single Estonian mother who fought back against Russian soldiers who tried to rape her and her children in the fall of 1944, is she a Nazi then? Was the Latvian farmer who tried to prevent Russian soldiers from looting and burning his farm and killing his family in the spring of 1941, is he a Nazi then? Were the Finnish soldiers in Karelia who tried to defend their country against Soviet Russian invasion in November 1939, were they all Nazis too then? From the arguments that I read on some extremist platforms, all of us here in Canada who rallied against Soviet occupation and their crimes in Central and Eastern Europe throughout the Cold War, we too could be painted with this same hateful generalization, and we are. All of this comes back to that one problem, ignorance. The lack of awareness of Ukrainian and more broadly Central and Eastern European history and the historical experiences of our communities. This lack of awareness provides Russian propagandists and their Canadian collaborators an opportunity and open pathway to manipulate history and incite hate. Perhaps the solution is mandatory education about the Holodomor and Soviet Russian atrocities against our nations, including our experiences of coming to Canada as refugees. In any case, the hateful Kremlin-aligned generalizations that have been permeated into this debate need to be toned down to stop any further incitement to hate. It's a threat to the cohesion of our nation, and our government needs to step up to examine its impacts on our communities in the coming public inquiry into foreign interference in Canada. And we must also enact the Foreign Influence Registry to identify the morally corrupt former diplomats, academics, and officials who enable Russia's criminal mafia regime's narratives here in Canada. I'll leave it there, and I hope to have a good discussion with all of you.
Marcus, we've realized that there's a lot of disinformation in Canada. Would you be able to comment on how the disinformation has been influencing Canadian society and how we could combat it?
Yeah, well, look, Russia has been very active in Canada, both in promoting disinformation, propaganda, but also influence operations. And this is going back to the Cold War, to 1945, when an agent working inside the Russian embassy basically took a trove of documents and released them and identified dozens of Canadians who had become Russian assets in promoting Russian disinformation and interests here in Canada. And so that's been going on for 80 years or so. And of course, we've seen an intensification of that in the past 8 years, starting in 2014 with the initial Russian invasion of Crimea, and certainly over the past 18 months during this latest war. And so we need to make sure that our Canadian elected officials and media are far more aware of these. And certainly over the past week or so, we've seen how Russia has gone really into overdrive in using some of these narratives to try and discredit Canadians of Ukrainian heritage.
So your suggestion is for individual cases to be addressed on an individual basis, or as a community combating it?
Well, look, I think that not just communities, but all Canadians need to be far more aware of what these narratives look like. And we know how Russia has been using disinformation to try and manipulate our democratic decision-making processes. So making sure that Canadians are aware of it, our media is aware of how Russia engages in these sorts of activities, and certainly all elected officials, so that that they have the cognitive resources to be able to detect them and reject them when they do come up.
Are there possibly courses or events that Canadians could join and learn about in order to be equipped with information?
Well, there are some, and the Canadian government has done some work in setting up institutions within the government to detect, monitor and detect and expose these sorts of narratives. The RRM, the Rapid Reaction Mechanism inside Global Affairs, is one of those institutions that's doing this pretty effectively. But we need to make sure that civil society organizations, including Ukrainian Canadian community organizations, do have those resources and are able to educate their own people about these sorts of narratives, because this isn't going to be just the government that's doing it. It has to be a whole of society approach to defending our information space against Russian disinformation.
During your presentation, you mentioned that there should be a directory put together of foreign operatives. Can you maybe explain what that is and how that could get started in Canada?
Right. It's what it's called is it's a foreign influence registry, and this is basically a registry that introduces transparency into our government to identify individuals, former diplomats, former officials, others who advocate on behalf of authoritarian regimes, not just Russia, but China as well, Iran. All of these regimes are actively using proxies inside of Canada to advance their causes and lobby on their behalf. And what this registry would do is simply add transparency so that we can identify who they are and that our elected officials can understand who exactly they're talking to when these people go knocking on their doors.
Thank you so much for today's presentation and for this interview. You're always very, detailed and very eloquent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for having me.